The fiddle screamed a merry lie. It skirled and danced in the humid Mississippi air, a frantic yellow ribbon of sound winding through the sweat-soaked bodies packed into the cavernous barn. Lanterns cast a jaundiced, flickering glow, making shadows leap and twist like hanged men on the rough-hewn timbers. The air, thick enough to drink, was a cocktail of cheap whiskey, pine shavings, sweat, and the cloying sweetness of honeysuckle drifting in from the dark. It was the annual harvest frolic at Magnolia Vale, Master Thorne's yearly performance of benevolence, a single night where the chains were loosened just enough to allow the illusion of joy. Caleb stood near the great open doors, a ghost at the feast. He was a cooper by trade, his hands maps of calluses and fine, pale scars from working oak and iron, but tonight they were just hands, slick with sweat and trembling slightly. He watched his wife, Sarah, her head wrapped in a blue kerchief, moving through the dance. She was a whisper of grace in a world of shouts, and the sight of her, even in this forced festivity, was the only thing that kept the world from cracking apart. Their son, Samuel, barely 6, was asleep on a pile of burlap sacks in the corner, his small chest rising and falling in the one true peace to be found on that plantation. Then he saw Silas Blackwood, the overseer. Blackwood moved through the crowd, not like a dancer, but like a shark through a school of fish, a predator enjoying the temporary frightlessness of his prey. He was a man carved from gristle and sour tobacco, his face a perpetual sneer under a sweat-stained felt hat. He stopped near Sarah, his voice a low, greasy rumble that Caleb could feel in his teeth, even from across the barn. He saw Blackwood's hand, thick-fingered and dirty, reach out and trail down Sarah's arm. She flinched, a small, bird-like movement, her face going still and smooth as a stone mask. Something in Caleb's chest, a thing he had kept caged and starving for a decade, broke its bonds. It wasn't a thought, it was a physical event, a rupture of blood and fire. The screaming fiddle, the stomping feet, the laughter, it all receded into a distant buzzing hum, the sound of 1,000 cicadas screaming in unison, the sound of summer, of suffering, of every day he had endured under Blackwood's shadow. He turned, his movements unnaturally calm. Just outside the barn door, propped against the wall, was a wood-splitting axe. Its handle, worn smooth by 100 other hands, felt like an extension of his own arm. He saw the world in shades of red and gray. The lantern light on the axe head was a smear of blood. He did not hear the music anymore. He heard only the cicadas, louder now, a deafening electric thrum that vibrated from the ground up through the soles of his worn-out boots. He walked back into the barn. No one noticed him at first. He was just Caleb, the quiet cooper, a fixture as unremarkable as the posts holding up the roof. He moved with a purpose that parted the crowd without a word. Blackwood was laughing now, his head thrown back, revealing a throat corded with muscle and vein. He had a tin cup of whiskey in one hand, the other resting proprietarily on the small of Sarah's back. Sarah's eyes found Caleb's over the overseer's shoulder, and in them he saw a universe of terror and resignation. That was the end of it. The first swing was a clean, rising arc. The polished steel caught the lantern light and held it for a perfect, silent moment before it descended. It made a sound unlike any other, not the clean *th walk* of splitting wood, but a wet, heavy crunch, a sound of crushed bone and torn sinew. The tin cup clattered to the floor, splashing whiskey onto the dusty planks. Blackwood's laugh was severed mid-gasp. His eyes, wide with a final, uncomprehending shock, were still on Sarah, as his body, suddenly boneless, began to fold. Caleb raised the axe again. The world was nothing but the weight of the hickory handle in his hands, the slickness of the blood, and the buzzing of the cicadas in his ears. The second blow fell, and the third. He was not chopping a man, he was chopping down a tree, a rotten, poisoned thing that had blighted the earth for too long. The barn went silent. The fiddle's merry lie died in a strangled squawk. The dancers froze, their bodies locked in grotesque poses of aborted joy. For a heartbeat, the only sounds were the drip of blood onto the floorboards and the soft, innocent sigh of Samuel sleeping on his sack pile. Then, the scream came. It was not Sarah, it was another woman, a high, piercing shriek that shattered the spell. The silence broke into 100 pieces of panicked sound. People scrambled backwards, stumbling over each other, their faces masks of horror. Caleb stood over the mangled thing that had been Silas Blackwood. The axe hung from his hand, dripping. He looked at his palm, at the jagged silver scar that puckered the skin near his thumb, a gift from Blackwood a year prior, when a barrel hoop had snapped. The scar was throbbing, a hot, insistent pulse, a second heartbeat in his hand. He looked up and met Sarah's eyes again. He saw no judgment there, only a devastating, bottomless grief. He had not saved her. He had only damned them both. He turned and walked out of the barn, out of the sickly yellow light, and into the vast, breathing darkness of the Mississippi night. He did not run. He walked, the bloody axe still in his hand, moving toward the cypress swamp that bordered the cotton fields, its black water awaiting maw. The cicadas sang him on his way, their chorus a primeval, knowing him. The hunt would begin at dawn. But for now, in the space between the last swing of the axe and the first bay of the hounds, there was only the night, the swamp, and the impossible, terrible taste of something that felt almost like freedom. The swamp swallowed him whole. One moment he was on the solid, unforgiving earth of the cotton field. The next he was sinking to his ankles in cool, fetid mud that sucked at his boots. The air changed instantly, becoming heavier, wetter, thick with the smell of decay and damp earth and things that had never seen the sun. The familiar chorus of cicadas was joined by the basso profundo of bullfrogs and the high, thin whine of mosquitoes that descended in a greedy cloud. Above, the cypress trees clawed at the moonless sky, their branches draped in Spanish moss that hung like the tattered shrouds of giants. He dropped the axe. The weight of it was an anchor, a tie to the barn, to the body, to the man he had been just minutes before. It landed with a soft thump and a splash in the dark water, and was gone. He felt a strange lightness in his arms. His hands were still slick, and he wiped them on his trousers, the gesture automatic, useless. The blood was not just on his skin, it was under his nails, in the creases of his palms, a stain he knew he would never wash away. He pushed deeper, guided by a primal instinct to put distance between himself and the barking that had already begun to erupt from the direction of the big house. The dogs, Thorne's prized walkers, bred for tracking men. Their howls were a promise. He stumbled over a submerged root, plunging to his knees in the black water. The cold was a shock, a sudden baptism that cleared his head for a moment. He scrambled up, gasping, his clothes now heavy and clinging. A memory surfaced, unbidden. Samuel, 2 years old, feverish in the night. Sarah, humming a low, wordless lullaby, a tune passed down from her grandmother, a melody of such profound sadness and love it could break your heart. She had hummed it while bathing Samuel's face with a cool cloth, her touch gentle, her presence a shield against the darkness. Caleb had stood in the doorway of their cabin, watching, feeling a love so fierce it was a physical pain, a vulnerability so absolute it terrified him. That was what Blackwood had threatened, not with a whip or a fist, but with a sneer and a look, a casual mention of sending Sarah to the breeding cabins downriver. Asterisk, a fine, strong girl like that. Asterisk, Blackwood had mused, spitting a stream of tobacco juice near Caleb's feet just yesterday. Asterisk, shame to waste her on one man. The memory fueled him. He was no longer just fleeing. He was running from that future, from the world where that thought could exist and be spoken aloud. He pushed through a thicket of saw palmetto, the fronds scratching at his face and arms. The night was a labyrinth of unseen dangers. Cotton mouths coiled on low-hanging branches, their bodies indistinguishable from the wood. Alligators, ancient and patient, lay submerged, with only their eyes breaking the surface of the water. But the true monster was behind him, the one with 2 legs and a pack of hounds. He paused to listen, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The barking was closer now, a chorus of excited, hungry bays. They had his scent. He pressed on, his lungs burning. The jagged scar on his palm began to itch, a phantom pain that always flared with fear or rage. It was from a barrel he'd been mending, the iron hoop rusted and weak. Blackwood had been watching, berating him for his slowness. Asterisk, faster, you lazy ox. The hoop had snapped under the pressure of the mallet, the sharp edge slicing Caleb's palm to the bone. Blackwood hadn't offered a bandage, only a laugh. Asterisk, now you'll remember to work faster. Caleb had wrapped the wound himself with a strip torn from his own shirt, the blood soaking through almost immediately. He had never forgotten. The scar was a testament, a physical record of a debt that had now been paid in full. He found a small island of solid ground, a hummock of earth, crowded with tupelo trees, and collapsed at the base of one. His breath came in ragged sobs. The world was a spinning vortex of darkness and sound. He was Caleb of Natchez. He was a cooper. He was a husband. He was a father. And now he was a murderer. The word felt strange, ill-fitting. What he had done in the barn felt more like an act of nature, like a flood or a fire, an inevitable consequence of unbearable pressure. It was not justice. Justice was a word for white men in courtrooms. This was something older, something that lived in the blood and the bone. He closed his eyes and saw Sarah's face, not as it was in the barn, but as it was in the quiet moments before dawn, her features soft in the gray light, her breath a warm presence beside him. He saw Samuel's hand curled in sleep, so small, so trusting. He had built a wall of his own body around them, a fragile defense against the horrors of Magnolia Vale. Tonight, that wall had crumbled, and he had unleashed a different kind of horror upon them. What would Thorn do to them now? The thought was a fresh agony, worse than the fear of the dogs. Would they be whipped, sold, separated forever? He had traded one certain damnation for another, uncertain one. He pushed himself to his feet. He could not stay here. He had to keep moving, to draw the hunt away from the plantation, to become a ghost, a rumor, a story whispered in the cabins at night. He looked down at his hands in the faint starlight that filtered through the canopy. They were the hands that had crafted barrels to hold sugar and cotton, the hands that had built his son's small cot, the hands that had held his wife. Now they were the hands of a killer. He plunged them into the swamp water, scrubbing at the drying blood, but it was no use. The stain was not on his skin. It was in his soul. The dogs howled again, closer this time. A sound that promised a faint reckoning was coming, carried on the hot, wet breath of the Mississippi night. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. By noon, the next day, the name of Caleb was on the lips of every white man in Adams County. Master Thaddeus Thorn, his face a mask of purple fury, had ridden into Natchez himself, his horse lathered and wild-eyed. He stormed into the sheriff's office, the heels of his fine leather boots striking the floorboards like hammers. "He butchered him!" Thorn's voice, usually a languid aristocratic drawl, was raw with rage. "Butchered my best overseer in front of 100 of my own people. With an axe." Sheriff Miller, a portly man whose main concerns were usually drunkards and land disputes, listened with a grim expression. This was different. This was not a simple runaway. This was an uprising of one. It was the nightmare that slept at the foot of every planter's bed. "We'll get him, Thaddeus," Miller assured him, already pulling out a sheet of paper and a pen. We'll form a patrol, and I'll get the poster printed. You have a description? Description? Thorne scoffed. He's 6 feet of muscle and hate. A cooper by trade. Strong hands. Has a jagged scar on his left palm. Moves quiet. Too quiet. I never liked the way he looked at you, like he was measuring you for a coffin. The poster went up before the sun set. It was tacked to the courthouse door, to the posts outside the slave market on Canal Street, to the doors of taverns and mercantile shops. $500 reward. Runaway slave. Wanted for murder. Escaped from the plantation of Thaddeus Thorne, Esquire, on the night of August 12, 1852. The Negro man, Caleb, approximately 30 years of age, stands near 6 feet in height, of a very dark complexion. He is a skilled cooper, well-muscled in the arms and chest. Has a noticeable jagged scar upon the palm of his left hand. The been said Caleb is wanted for the brutal and cowardly murder of Mr. Silas Blackwood. He is cunning and extremely dangerous. The above reward of $500 will be paid for his capture and delivery to me, or for proof of his death. Thaddeus Thorne, Magnolia Vale Plantation, Natchez. The paper was a stark white flag of war against a single man. The price, $500, was a fortune. It was enough to buy a small farm, to purchase 2 or 3 prime field hands. It was a sum designed to turn every poor white farmer, every boatman on the river, every desperate man with a gun into a hunter. The hunt was led not by the sheriff, but by a man Thorne had sent for from Vicksburg, a specialist. His name was Jedediah Kane. He was not a slave patroller, who were often just thuggish local boys on a night's lark. Kane was a professional, a man who tracked men for a living. He arrived on a mud-spattered roan, a brace of lean, silent dogs loping at his heels, their eyes a pale, unnerving blue. They were not the loud, baying hounds of the plantation pack. They were killers, bred for silence and tenacity. Kane was a man as lean and silent as his dogs. He didn't speak to Thorne or the sheriff. He went straight to the barn. The frolic was long over. The blood stain on the floor was a dark, ugly map of the previous night's events. Kane knelt, touching the edge of it with a single gloved finger. He sniffed the air, his expression unreadable. He walked to the edge of the swamp and found the discarded axe, its handle still bearing a faint, rusty smear. He examined it, then tossed it aside. He spent the rest of the day in the slave quarters. He did not ask questions with a whip, as Thorne would have. His method was quieter, more insidious. He moved from cabin to cabin, his shadow falling across the doorways. He looked at the faces of the people, searching for a flicker of knowledge, of sympathy, of fear. He stopped at Caleb's cabin. It was empty. Thorne had already moved Sarah and Samuel to the old infirmary building near the big house, under lock and key. Kane entered the small, dark space. It was neat, almost bare. A small cot Caleb had built for his son stood in one corner. A wooden spoon, half carved from a piece of cypress, lay on a stool. On the wall, a single strip of blue cloth, the same color as the kerchief Sarah had worn, was tucked into a crack in the chinking. Kane picked it up. He held it to his nose. Then he took it outside to his dogs. He let the lead dog, a scarred brute named Ghost, sniff the cloth. The dog's head lifted, its nose twitching, tasting the air. A low growl rumbled in its chest. Kane had the scent he needed. He also found something else. In the ashes of the cabin's small fire pit, he uncovered the charred remains of a book. Most of it was gone, but a few fragments of a page were legible. It was a child's primer. Times A is for apple. B is for boy. Someone had been teaching the boy, Samuel, to read. A forbidden act. A seed of defiance planted long before the axe ever fell. Kane crumpled the burned page in his fist. This wasn't just a simple brute who had snapped. This was a man with thoughts, with plans, with something to protect. This made him more dangerous. more interesting. As dusk fell, Jedediah Kane and his silent dogs melted into the cypress swamp. The official patrol, with their loud talk and their flasks of whiskey, crashed about the swamp's edge, a noisy, useless distraction. Kane moved differently. He was a creature of the swamp himself now, patient and lethal. He knew the man he was hunting was not just an animal to be cornered. He was hunting a mind, and the hunt had just begun. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Days bled into a week. Caleb lived in a twilight world, a waking dream of fear and exhaustion. The swamp was his sanctuary and his prison. He learned its rhythms, its secret language. He learned which mushrooms were safe to eat and which would kill him. He learned to catch frogs and small fish with his bare hands in the murky water. He learned the difference between the grunt of a bullfrog and the deeper, more menacing grunt of an alligator. He moved mostly at night, navigating by the stars he could glimpse through the canopy, traveling through the water whenever possible to hide his trail. The water was his ally, washing away his scent, confusing the dogs. He became a nocturnal creature, his skin pale and perpetually damp, his eyes accustomed to the deep shadows. During the day, he would find a hiding place, a hollow log, a thicket of cane so dense it was like a wall, or high in the branches of a cypress, perched precariously over the black water. In these moments of forced stillness, his mind would turn on him. The buzzing of the cicadas, a constant, oppressive sound, was the soundtrack to his torment. It was the sound of the barn, the sound of Blackwood's life ending. It was the sound of his own life, unspooling into this desperate, hunted existence. He would trace the jagged scar on his palm, the flesh a permanent reminder of the catalyst. It seemed to have a life of its own now, a phantom itch that warned him of danger. He'd feel it prickle and burn just moments before he'd hear the distant sound of the patrol crashing through the undergrowth, and he would freeze, becoming part of the landscape, a shadow among shadows. His greatest torture was the memory of Sarah and Samuel. He would close his eyes and try to summon their faces, but fear would corrupt the images. He saw Sarah not smiling, but weeping. He saw Samuel not sleeping peacefully, but crying out for his father. He imagined them in the infirmary, locked away, being questioned, being threatened. Had Thorn hurt them? The thought was a physical blow, leaving him breathless and shaking. He started humming the lullaby Sarah always sang to Samuel. At first it was unconscious, a low, tuneless sound in his throat as he huddled in the dark. Then it became a ritual, a prayer. He would hum the simple, aching melody to himself, and for a few precious moments, the swamp, the dogs, and the fear would recede. It was a thread connecting him to them, a way of holding them in his mind without letting the horror consume him. The melody was his only possession, his only piece of home in the wilderness. One evening, crouched in a canebrake near the edge of the swamp, he risked a glimpse of the world he had left behind. He could see the distant flickering lights of the slave quarters at Magnolia Vale. He watched the tiny figures move about, their day's work done. Was she there? Could she see the same stars he was looking at? A profound loneliness washed over him, so vast and cold it was like the swamp water itself seeping into his bones. He was a ghost, haunting the edges of his own life. He knew he couldn't stay in the swamp forever. His body was weakening. A fever had taken hold, a product of a festering cut on his leg and the constant dampness. He needed to get away, to go north. The word was a myth, a legend whispered in the dark of the cabins. North. A place where a man could be a man. But the north was 1,000 miles of hostile territory away. His chance came in the form of a storm. The sky, which had been a hazy, oppressive gray for days, turned the color of a bruise. The air grew still and heavy, and the cicadas fell silent, a sudden unnerving absence of sound. Then the wind came, roaring through the cypress trees, tearing at the Spanish moss. Rain followed, not a shower, but a solid, blinding wall of water that turned the swamp into a churning river. Caleb knew this was his opportunity. The rain would wash away any trace of him, would render the dogs useless. He had to move now. He stumbled through the gale, the wind and rain a furious cleansing force. He made his way to the edge of the swamp that bordered the Pearl River. The river was his road, his only hope of escape. He found a logjam, a tangle of fallen trees and debris pushed against the bank. It was treacherous, but it was a bridge of sorts. As lightning split the sky, illuminating the scene in a series of stark, terrifying flashes, he began to climb over the slippery, churning logs, heading for the opposite bank. He didn't see the man until he was almost on top of him. Huddled under an overhang on the far side of the river was another figure, a man as soaked and miserable as himself. As another flash of lightning lit up the man's face, Caleb saw he was another runaway, his clothes in tatters, his face gaunt with hunger and fear. They stared at each other for a long moment, two lost souls, meeting in the heart of the tempest. "They hunted, you too?" the man asked, his voice barely a whisper above the storm's roar. Caleb nodded, unable to speak. "The patrollers are thick, round here," the man said, his eyes darting nervously into the darkness. "But they won't be out in this. This storm is a gift from God." He looked at Caleb, a flicker of something like hope in his eyes. "You heading north?" Caleb nodded again. "Me too," the man said. Maybe we go together. Two men stand a better chance than one." Caleb looked at the man, at his desperate hope. He had been alone for so long, the thought of another human presence was both a comfort and a terror. Another person was another risk, another mouth to feed, another set of tracks to cover. But the man's words, "Nussa's a better chance, Nussa's played," echoed in his exhausted mind. He gave a third, final nod. As the storm raged around them, Caleb and the stranger, whose name was Moses, began their journey north, two solitary sparks of defiance moving through a vast and hostile darkness. The hunt was far from over, but for the first time since he had walked out of that barn, Caleb was not entirely alone. Astashas Jedediah Cain was not a man to be deterred by a storm. While the other patrollers retreated to the warmth of their cabins and their whiskey, Cain was at the edge of the churning swamp, his pale-eyed dogs whining and restless at his side. He was a creature of patience. The rain that was a gift to Caleb was, to Cain, merely an inconvenience, a temporary fog upon the map of his pursuit. He spent the storm-tossed night in a dilapidated trapper's lean-to he knew of, cleaning his rifle by the light of a single candle, his mind working with cold, methodical precision. He had pieced together a portrait of his quarry. Caleb was not a panicked animal. He was intelligent. He used the water. He moved at night. He was a survivor. The burnt primer in the cabin fireplace told Cain that Caleb was a man who thought about the future, who dreamed of something more for his child. Such a man was predictable in his own way. He would not simply run and hide forever. He would be running for something, or someone. When the dawn broke, gray and weeping, Cain was already moving. The ground was a sea of mud, all tracks washed away. But Cain wasn't looking for tracks. He was looking for signs. A broken branch that had been snapped by a passing body, not the wind. A patch of moss disturbed on a log. He was reading the swamp story of the night before. He found the logjam on the Pearl River. And he found two sets of footprints in the mud on the far bank, heading north. He stood there for a long time, the dogs sniffing eagerly at the faint, rain-washed scent. Two of them. This changed the equation. It made them more vulnerable, more likely to be seen. It also made them more dangerous. Cain felt a cold thrill, the pure, clean feeling of the hunt narrowing, the prey revealing its path. He did not hurry. He let the dogs get their fill of the scent. Then he set off at a steady, ground-eating pace, a patient wolf on a long trail. Days later, in a dusty office in Natchez, Thaddeus Thorne read a letter from a neighboring plantation owner, a man named Fitzhugh. His face, which had been slowly returning to its normal pallor, darkened once more. "My dearest Thaddeus, I write with troubling news. One of my own bucks, a sullen fellow named Moses, absconded 2 nights past, during the storm. My overseer reports he took with him a side of bacon and a small sack of cornmeal. I suspect he may be making for the Free States. I have my own men out, of course, but I thought it prudent to inform you. It occurs to me that your murderous Cooper may have found himself an accomplice. A lone wolf is one thing, but a pack is another matter entirely. We must crush this defiance before it spreads like a fever. I trust your man Kane is earning his keep. These are dark times when a man is not safe from his own property. And your servant, Henry Fitzhugh." Thorne crumpled the letter in his fist. A pack. The idea was poison. It suggested organization, community, a network of resistance that planters like him spent their lives denying could ever exist. He penned an immediate, furious reply to Kane, sending it via a fast rider. "Nive Kane, the runaway has a partner, a Negro named Moses from the Fitzhugh place. This changes nothing, except the urgency. I want them found. I want Caleb made an example of. I don't care if you bring him back in 1 piece or a dozen, so long as the lesson is clear. The reward stands. Do not fail me. Calence toward P. Thorne." He then went to the old infirmary. Sarah was sitting on a stool, her back ramrod straight, her face a stoic, unreadable mask. Samuel was at Creckley feet, playing with a small wooden bird Caleb had carved for him. The boy looked up as Thorne entered, his eyes wide with fear. "Your man has found a friend," Thorne said, his voice dripping with venom. He enjoyed these visits, enjoyed watching for the cracks in her composure. "They are running together, like a pair of wild dogs." Sarah said nothing, her gaze fixed on a point on the far wall. "The bounty is $500, Sarah," Thorne continued, circling her slowly. "A man could be forgiven for shooting such a creature on sight for that kind of money, like a bear or a wolf that's been killing livestock. It would be a mercy, perhaps. Better than what will happen to him if Kane brings him back alive." He paused, letting the silence stretch. "I am a patient man, but my patience has its limits. If Caleb is not found, I will have to recoup my losses. You are a strong breeder, and the boy would fetch a fair price in New Orleans." He saw it then, a flicker in her eyes, a tremor in her hands. He had found the crack. He smiled, a thin, cruel twisting of his lips. "Think on it," he said, and left, the sound of the key turning in the lock echoing in the small stone room. Outside, Sarah finally broke. A single, silent tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She pulled Samuel close, burying her face in his hair, and began to hum. It was the lullaby, a low, desperate, heartbreaking sound, a shield of melody against a world of pain. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. The partnership with Moses was a fragile thing, born of shared desperation. For weeks they traveled north, following the river, moving through the tangled wilderness that bordered the plantations of Mississippi and Tennessee. They were a study in contrasts. Caleb was silent, watchful, his senses honed by his time alone in the swamp. Moses was younger, more impulsive, his fear often manifesting as a nervous energy, a constant need to talk, to plan, to hope aloud. "They say there's people up north," Moses would whisper as they huddled over a small, smokeless fire of dry twigs. "White folks even, Quakers, they call 'em. They'll help you. Give you a new name, a new life. Caleb would just nod, his eyes scanning the surrounding darkness. He did not trust in the kindness of strangers, white or black. He trusted only in his own strength, in the silence of the forest, in the itch of the scar on his palm that still served as his compass of fear. They survived on what they could steal and what they could catch: a chicken from a poorly guarded coop, a handful of corn from the edge of a field, fish they trapped in creek beds. They grew leaner, harder, their faces covered in beards, their clothes turning to rags. They were becoming wild things, men shedding the skin of the plantation, yet the plantation was always with them. Caleb carried it in the recurring nightmare of the barn, the sound of the axe, the look in Sarah's eyes. He carried it in the lullaby he still hummed to himself when Moses was asleep, a secret conversation with a life he might never see again. The cicadas of the south had been replaced by the chirping of crickets and the calls of whippoorwills, but in his mind, the buzzing never truly stopped. It was the baseline of his existence. One afternoon they stumbled upon a small, abandoned church in the middle of the woods. It was a simple, clapboard structure, its paint peeled, its windows broken. Inside, dust motes danced in the shafts of light, slanting down from the holes in the roof. It felt safe. A holy place, forgotten by the world. They decided to rest there for a day. As Moses slept, Caleb explored the small building. He found a tattered hymnal lying on the floor, its pages swollen with damp. He couldn't read the words, but he recognized the shapes of the letters from the primer he had tried to use with Samuel. He traced the letters with his finger, the act, a communion with his lost son, times A is for angel, B is for belief. He felt a wave of grief so powerful it brought him to his knees. He was a father with no child, a husband with no wife. What was he running toward, if not them? What was freedom, if it was a solitary confinement in a vast, empty wilderness? That night, their sanctuary was violated. They were woken by the sound of voices, the telltale jingle of harnesses. A patrol. They had been careless, staying in one place for too long. They scrambled out a back window and plunged into the woods. Just as the riders surrounded the church, they ran, blindly, through the undergrowth, the shouts of the men and the baying of dogs behind them. A gunshot cracked through the night, the ball whining past Caleb's ear. They were separated in the chaos. Caleb dove into a ravine, tumbling down a steep, muddy embankment, and landing in a shallow, fast-moving creek. He stayed there, submerged to his neck, his head hidden beneath an overhanging root, for what felt like hours. He heard the patrol crashing through the woods above him, their lanterns casting frantic, dancing beams of light. He heard them call to each other, their voices fading as they moved on. When silence finally returned, he pulled himself from the water, shivering and gasping. He was alone. Moses was gone. Had he been caught? Had he escaped? Caleb didn't know. He was back where he had started, solitary, hunted, with nothing but the ghosts in his head for company. The brief illusion of partnership had been shattered, and the loneliness that returned was sharper, more profound than before. He looked at his hand. The scar on his palm was a fiery, throbbing line. The danger was not past. It was all around him. He pushed on, his pace more frantic now. He was no longer just moving north. He was running from the ghost of Moses, from the failure of their partnership, from the renewed certainty that he was utterly, terrifyingly alone. The lullaby he hummed that night was not a comfort. It was a lament. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Jedediah Kane found the abandoned church 2 days later. He wasn't following the chaotic trail of the local patrol. He was following the quieter, more deliberate trail of his quarry. He noted the 2 sets of tracks leading away from the church and the single set of tracks from the patrol's horses. He found the place where one man had scrambled down the ravine into the creek. He found no sign of the other. The local patrol had caught Moses. Kane had no interest in him. He was a distraction. His target was Caleb. Kane rode into the nearby town, a shabby collection of buildings that served the local farmers. He found the sheriff and the patrolman in the tavern, celebrating their capture. Moses was chained in a small cell behind the sheriff's office, his face bruised, his spirit broken. "You missed the other one," Kane said, his voice flat, cutting through their drunken boasts. The sheriff, a man named Cobb, bristled. "We got the one we found. Fitzhugh will be pleased. There was only one set of tracks." "There were two," Kane corrected him. "The one you want, the one Thorn is paying for, is still out there. He went into the creek. You lost him." Kane left them to their ale. He bought a fresh loaf of bread and some salted pork, his movements economical, his face giving nothing away. But as he left the mercantile, he saw a notice tacked to the wall. It was not a bounty poster. It was a broadside, an advertisement for an auction. Estate sale by order of the court, to be held at the Fitzhugh Plantation, Saturday, the 20th of September. Property of the late Henry Fitzhugh, Esquire, deceased of sudden ague. Including 12 prime field hands, 4 household servants, 2 skilled artisans, blacksmith, weaver, and sundry other effects, all to be sold to the highest bidder. Kane read the notice twice. Fitzhugh was dead. That meant his property, including the captured runaway Moses, would be sold. But it also meant something else. A large gathering. A crowd. A perfect place for a man to disappear. Or a perfect place for a hunter to set a trap. He rode back to Magnolia Vale. The news of Fitzhugh's death and the upcoming auction had already reached Thaddeus Thorn, who saw it as an opportunity. "I'll buy the boy Moses back," Thorn said to Kane, a cruel smile on his lips, "and then I'll make an example of him in front of my people." A reminder of the price of foolishness. He paused, looking at Kane. "But it's Caleb I want." "He's heading for the Ohio River," Kane said. "He's smart. He stays off the roads, but he's getting tired. Desperate. A man like that, who ran for his family, might do a foolish thing if he thought he could get news of them." A slow, ugly idea began to form in Thorn's mind. "News," he repeated softly. He looked out the window, toward the old infirmary where Sarah and Samuel were still being held. The plan was as simple as it was monstrous. Thorn would attend the Fitzhugh auction, but he wouldn't go alone. He would take Sarah and Samuel with him. They would be his bait. The word would be spread, whispered by sympathetic, stable hands, by riverboat crews, by the intricate, invisible network of communication that connected the enslaved people of the river valleys. Caleb's wife and son are at the Fitzhugh place. They're going to be sold. It was a lie, of course. Thorn had no intention of selling them. They were far too valuable as leverage. But Caleb wouldn't know that. "He'll hear the rumor," Thorn said, his eyes gleaming, "and he'll come. He won't be able to stay away. He'll try to see them, to get to them, and when he does, you'll be waiting." Kane listened, his face impassive. It was a good plan. It preyed on the man's only known weakness, his heart. It turned his love into a weapon against him. Kane simply nodded. The morality of the trap was not his concern. He was a hunter, and this was how you cornered an intelligent, dangerous animal. You used its own nature against it. A week later, the rumor began to travel north on the wind and the water. It was a poison whispered from one to another, a story of a woman and a child to be sold at a dead man's auction. The story traveled faster than any rider, passed along the secret pathways of hope and despair. And it was only a matter of time before it found the one man it was intended for, a man who hummed a sad lullaby to himself in the darkness, and whose greatest strength had just become his most fatal vulnerability. Asterisk, asterisk. Asterisk Caleb heard the news from a river woman, an old free black woman who pulled a small skiff selling herbs and poultices to the plantations along the river. He had crept down to the river bank at dusk, desperate to buy or trade for a bit of salt, when he saw her. She looked at his ragged clothes and the haunted look in his eyes and seemed to understand everything. "You, a runaway," she stated, her voice low and gravelly. It wasn't a question. Caleb didn't answer. "There's a lot of talk up and down the river," she continued, not looking at him but at the far bank. "Talk of the Axeman from the Thorn place." She paused. "And talk of his wife and boy. They say Thorn is taking them to the Fitzhugh auction, putting them on the block." The world tilted. The solid ground beneath Caleb's feet felt like it was crumbling away. The cicada buzz, which had been a dull hum in the back of his mind for weeks, roared back to life, a deafening scream of static. Sarah, Samuel, on the block, to be sold like cattle, sent to God knows where, separated forever. The image was more horrific than any vision of his own capture and death. When? He managed to croak, his throat tight with panic. "Saturday," the woman said. "2 days from now." She looked at him then, her eyes dark and full of a weary pity. "It's a trap, you know. They want you. This is how they'll get you." Caleb knew she was right. His rational mind, the part of him that had survived the swamp and the patrols, screamed at him to run, to keep going north, to save himself. But the image of his son's face, of his wife's eyes, blotted out all reason. What was the point of his own freedom if it was bought with their eternal bondage? He had started this to protect them. He couldn't abandon them now. He spent the next 2 days in a fever of indecision and despair. He walked for miles, a caged animal, his mind a battlefield. He saw the trap as clearly as if it were a set of iron jaws laid in his path. He knew Cain would be there, the man with the pale-eyed dogs and the patient, relentless presence. He knew Thorn would be there, savoring his victory. To go to the Fitzhugh plantation was to walk into his own execution, but to not go, was to live the rest of his life with the knowledge that he had let them be sold, that he had chosen his own skin over theirs. The lullaby Sarah hummed played on a loop in his memory, a melody of accusation. The jagged scar on his palm ached with a dull, insistent fire, a constant reminder of the promise he had made to himself when Blackwood had threatened his family. On the morning of the auction, he made his decision. He would go. He would not try to rescue them. That was impossible, a fool's dream. But he had to see them. He had to know they were all right. And perhaps, just perhaps, he could create a diversion, a fire, a moment of chaos that might give them a chance to escape themselves. Or, if not that, a chance to show them he had not abandoned them. A final, desperate act of love. He traveled the last few miles with a reckless speed, all caution thrown to the wind. He was no longer a fugitive hiding in the shadows. He was a man with a singular, terrible purpose. He stole a horse from a field, a sway-backed old mare, and rode it hard, not caring who saw him. The Fitzhugh plantation was a hive of activity. Carriages and wagons choked the lane leading to the big house. White planters in their Sunday best, their wives in silks and lace, mingled on the lawn, drinking juleps and talking of cotton prices and the weather. It was a grotesque garden party, the main event of which was the buying and selling of human beings. Caleb tethered the horse in a thicket a half-mile away and approached the plantation on foot, circling around through the woods until he came to the back of the slave quarters. From a rise overlooking the main grounds, he could see the auction block, a crude wooden platform erected near the barns. He could see the enslaved people of the Fitzhugh estate huddled together, their faces numb with dread, waiting to be inspected and sold. And then he saw them, Sarah and Samuel, standing near the platform, apart from the others. Thorn was there, a few feet away, talking with another planter. Sarah stood as she always did, with a quiet, unbreakable dignity, her hand resting on Samuel's shoulder. Samuel was clutching the small wooden bird Caleb had made for him, his eyes wide and frightened, taking in the terrifying scene. Caleb's heart shattered. They were real. They were there. The rumor was true. The river woman's warning, his own instincts. It all evaporated in the face of that sight. The need to get closer, to be near them, was a physical force, pulling him forward. He crept closer, using the barns and outbuildings for cover. The auction was beginning. The auctioneer, a fat man with a booming voice, was extolling the virtues of a young field hand. Caleb's focus was entirely on Sarah and Samuel. He had to get their attention, to let them know he was there. He found what he was looking for in the cooperage, Fitzhugh's old workshop. A pile of dry wood shavings. A can of turpentine. It was a tinderbox. The barn next to it was filled with hay, cured and ready to go up like a torch. A fire. It would create the chaos he needed. He worked quickly, his hands sure and steady. He doused the shavings in turpentine. He laid a trail to the open door of the hay barn. All he needed was a spark. He felt a strange calm settle over him. He was no longer afraid. The world had narrowed to this single act. He would burn it all down. He was about to strike the flint when he heard a sound behind him, a soft footfall. He turned, his body tensing. It was not Cain. It was not Thorn. It was Sarah. She had seen him. While Thorn was distracted, she had whispered to Samuel to stay put, and had slipped away, moving with a ghost's quietness between the buildings. Her face was a canvas of love and terror. "Caleb," she breathed, her voice a sound he thought he would never hear again. They stared at each other for a timeless moment. The sounds of the auction, the world itself, faded away. He saw the new lines of grief etched around her eyes. She saw the wildness in his, the desperation. "They're not selling us," she said, her words coming in a rush. "It's a lie, a trap to catch you," Thorn told me. "He said he would bring you back in chains." Caleb looked from her face to the auction block, and back again. The truth of it settled in his bones, cold and heavy as lead. He had walked right into it. "You have to go," she pleaded, her hands reaching for him, but not daring to touch. "Now, run north, and don't look back. Live, Caleb. Live for me. Live for Samuel. That is all I ask." He looked past her, toward the lawn. He saw a man detach himself from the shadows of the big house. A lean man, moving with a hunter's grace. Jedediah Cain. He had been spotted. The trap was closing. "There's no time," Caleb said, his voice raw. He looked at the turpentine-soaked shavings. The fire was still his only answer, not to save them, but to save himself. To give himself the chaos he needed to escape. But then he looked at Sarah's face. If he started a fire, she and Samuel would be in the middle of the ensuing panic. They could be trampled, hurt. He would be trading their safety for his own. The lullaby filled his head, the simple, sad notes. It was a song of protection, of selfless love. He could not be the danger that hurt them. "Go back to Samuel," he said, his voice firm. He gave her a look, a final, desperate message of love, of apology, of farewell. "Keep him safe. Hum him our song." She hesitated, tears streaming down her face. A shout went up from the direction of the lawn. Cain had raised his hand, pointing toward the barns. "Go!" Caleb hissed. Sarah turned and ran, a silent, weeping wraith, melting back toward the crowd, just as the first of the armed men started running toward the barns. Caleb was alone again, with the trap sprung all around him. He took one last look in the direction of his wife and son. Then he turned and ran, not toward the fire he had prepared, but deeper into the plantation, toward the river, the last, most desperate gamble of all. The hunt was no longer a thing of shadows and whispers. It was a full-throated cry, and he was at the heart of it. The world erupted in shouts and gunfire. Caleb ran with a wild, desperate energy he didn't know he possessed. The calm he'd felt was gone, replaced by a pure animal instinct to survive. Bullets splintered the wood of the barn wall beside him. He vaulted a fence, his muscles screaming in protest, and sprinted across an open field that led down to the river. He was a perfect target, a single dark figure against a backdrop of green. He could hear Kane's voice, sharp and clear, cutting through the din. "To the river! Cut him off!" The riverbank was a steep, muddy slope. Caleb didn't slow down. He plunged down the embankment, half sliding, half falling, and hit the water with a jarring splash. The current of the Mississippi was powerful, a brown, swirling force that immediately tugged at him, trying to pull him under. He fought against it, his arms and legs pumping, striking out for the opposite shore. He was 100 feet out when the dogs arrived at the bank, barking in a frenzy. Kane was right behind them, his rifle at his shoulder. He took aim, his movements unhurried, precise. The first shot kicked up a spray of water just to Caleb's left. The second was closer, so close. Caleb felt the buzz of it as it passed his head. He dove, letting the current take him, the muddy water a temporary shield. He came up for air, gasping, and saw them on the far bank. Thorne, his face contorted in a mask of pure hate, and next to him Sarah, holding Samuel tightly, her face turned away. She wouldn't watch. Caleb dove again. His lungs were on fire. His body was a dead weight, his ragged clothes dragging him down. The far shore seemed a fought shore, million miles away. He surfaced one last time, his vision blurring, the sounds of the chase fading. He saw Kane lowering his rifle. He saw a boat being pushed into the water. They were coming for him. He took one last, ragged breath and let the river take him. He did not fight it anymore. He surrendered to the current, to the cold, to the immense, indifferent power of the water. His last conscious thought was not of fear, but of the lullaby, the melody, a final, gentle comfort as the brown water closed over his head and the world went dark and silent. On the bank, Jedediah Kane watched the spot where Caleb had gone under. He stood for a full minute, his rifle held loosely at his side. The ripples subsided. There was nothing. Thorne came up beside him, his breath coming in ragged pants. "Did you get him?" Thorne demanded. "The river got him," Kane said, his voice flat. "They searched for 2 days. They dragged the river. They patrolled the banks for miles downstream. They found a piece of his torn shirt snagged on a branch. They found a smear of blood on a rock where he might have struck his head. But they never found a body. Caleb of Natchez was gone, vanished, swallowed by the great muddy artery of the continent. Thaddeus Thorne, denied the satisfaction of a hanging, returned to Magnolia Vale a bitter, furious man. Jedediah Kane collected half his fee and rode out of Natchez, the ghost of his quarry forever eluding him. In the slave quarters of Magnolia Vale, and up and down the river, the story was whispered in the dark. Some said the axeman had drowned, his body food for the gar and the turtles. Others said he had made it, that he had somehow crossed the river and, touched by a dark magic, had walked out of the water on the other side and kept going north. A man who could not be killed. The story grew into a legend, a myth to give hope in a hopeless world. The man was gone, but the story remained. Jot maintain, Nide Budgeons. Budgeonsadad, his winning croak stored time. 1922. 1922. 19. Nide. A young woman named Eleanor Vance sat in the sweltering heat of her South Side apartment, a box of her late grandmother's effects open on her lap. Her grandmother, Sarah Ann, had been the daughter of a man named Samuel, a quiet, dignified man who had been born into slavery in Mississippi and had come north as a boy after the Great War of Liberation, as he called it. He had worked as a cooper his whole life, his hands strong and skilled, even in old age. He rarely spoke of his time before, but he carried a sadness in his eyes that never left him. Among the yellowed photographs and worn Bibles, Eleanor found a small, hand-carved wooden bird, its surface worn smooth by the touch of many hands. Tucked inside a small, leather-bound book of poetry was a letter. The paper was brittle, the ink faded to a rusty brown. It was dated 1888, from a Quaker community in southern Ohio. The handwriting was careful, deliberate, the script of someone who had learned to write late in life. My dearest Sarah, I do not know if this letter will ever find you, or if you are even still in the world to receive it. I have sent one every year to the same woman in Natchez who promised to try and find you, and every year I pray. I pray you are free. I pray you are well. I live. I am a free man, in a free state. I own my own cooperage. I am known here as Joseph. It is a quiet life, but there is not a day that goes by that I do not see your face, or our boys. I see him in the faces of the children in the street, and I wonder what kind of man he has grown to be. Do you ever hum our song? Sometimes, when the night is quiet, I think I can hear it on the wind, traveling all the way from Mississippi. I hum it too. It is the only prayer I have left. I carry you both with me, always. My hand aches sometimes, where the mark is, and I remember why I am here, and what it cost. I do not know if what I did was right in the eyes of God, but I know it was the only thing I could do in the eyes of a father. I pray Samuel understands that. I am an old man now, but my love for you is not old. It is the same as it was on that last day. It is the only thing that is truly real. Your loving husband, Caleb. Eleanor stared at the letter, her heart pounding. Caleb. The name was a ghost from a story her grandfather Samuel had told her once, and only once, on a rainy afternoon. A story of a terrible night, a barn dance, and a brave, terrifying father he barely remembered. A man who had vanished into the river like a legend. Her grandfather had never known if his father had lived or died. He had carried that uncertainty with him his entire life. She looked down at her own hand, and she smiled, a sad, knowing smile. For on the palm of her left hand, faint but unmistakable, was a small, strangely shaped birthmark, a jagged, silver line, like an old and faded scar. Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Was it an act of murder or an act of war? In the neat, ordered ledgers of the plantation, it was the destruction of property and the killing of an agent. In the eyes of the law, it was a capital crime. But in the space where a man's soul is his own, in the sacred ground of a father's love for his child, what was it? Perhaps it was simply an answer, a response to a question that had been asked for 200 years. The question was, how much can a man endure before he is no longer a man? The answer that rang out in the barn that night was not spoken in words, but in the swing of an axe. It was a terrible, bloody, and undeniable affirmation of humanity in a world that sought to erase it. Caleb's story, like so many others, dissolves into the great, murky river of history. Did he die in the Mississippi, his body swept out to the Gulf? Or did he live out his days as Joseph the Cooper in Ohio, a free man forever haunted by the family he had to abandon to save them? The ambiguity is, perhaps, the point. His survival was not guaranteed, and his freedom, if he found it, was a wounded, incomplete thing. But the act itself became a seed. It grew into a story, a legend, a whispered piece of folklore that outlived the plantation, the master, and the institution itself. It was a story about a man who refused to break, who answered inhumanity with brutal finality. It is a reminder that a system built on the denial of one's humanity will inevitably, and often violently, be met with its fierce and desperate assertion. Freedom is not a gift. It is a claim, staked with courage, with blood, and with a love so powerful it can burn down the world.